things can go wrong. And by way of example or warning, years ago I had a friend before computerized dating came along, and he had started a dating service. A woman called him up from, she was here from Switzerland, and she was studying to be a doctor, and she was heir to the Barton Candy family fortune. So he immediately married her. This was on the punchline. So he immediately married her, and I said, Charles, I said, you know, a guy starts a dating service and he marries a woman who called. I said, I think I can get you a lot of publicity. So I sent out a release, and every local show in the New York area wanted to have them on. And one show called the John Bartholomew Tucker Show, some of you may remember it, was an interview show. They wanted to put him on Valentine's Day and call him the love couple of the year. Meanwhile, Charles, who's very intense, called me up. He says, Berman, I gotta get out of this marriage. She's crazy, she's this and that. I said, Charles. I said, you gotta stay married until the John Bartholomew Tucker Show. Well, they went on the air, love couple of the year, live, and they had a fight live on the air. She called him ugly, stupid, every name in the book. So it's very unpredictable what can happen. But to be illustrative of the subject of the day, which is creative publicity, I thought it would be interesting to start out with a project that I'm right in the middle of. This week, thank you, John. This week, I just came back from Ohio with a yin yoga instructor whose intention is eventually to be on Oprah and Ellen and the Today Show and so forth, hopefully. And so I suggested that perhaps we start out, because you can't get on these major shows unless you have a reel of prior appearances. No one's going to put you on the Today Show unless they can see that you're comfortable being on television. So our plan was to start out and get on some smaller market shows, edit together a reel of good appearances, and then move up to like Los Angeles and New York, and then hopefully move up to the networks. But the thing is, she's a yoga instructor, and they're probably one at every street corner. There's so many of them. How do you differentiate? So, in order to get picked up by the media, how do you make yourself special? In my own case, what I do is, if a client comes to me, I do a long interview with the person, and I look for that one differentiator that makes it stand out from the others. Now, there's a yoga convention coming up in Toronto. There are 1,800 yoga instructors. How do you make this person stand out? In this case, this woman specializes in what she calls yin yoga, which is where you get in stationary positions for 5 minutes, and supposedly that causes you to relax. But as I did the interview, she told me about one yoga position in which she ties your feet together. So I imagine, well, this might be fun. We'll have the host of the program have their feet tied together while they're talking, or at least it would appeal to, and I'm going to read this just because we are on television here and people can't see it. So I wrote up this quote, pitch letter to the media. Dear Kelly, if suggested guest Noel Schroeder were to tie your host's feet together, don't worry. It's just part of the fascinating exercises she demonstrates in a fun and fascinating segment that will teach your host and viewers how to totally relax in just 5 minutes' time. The miracle of the yin style of yoga is that it works through assuming postures and deep passive stretches that help release tension, stress, and anxiety. Some of these postures look, frankly, a bit oddball, but that's all part of the fun as you're learning how to totally relax without any exertion or strenuous exercises. Well, the point is that everybody wants to have them on. So we've taken something that might ordinarily be a little bit mundane, and we've looked for that aspect of it that's new and different. And that, in terms of creative publicity, is what you really have to do. I have a couple of guests here today. One is an NBC producer and one is a client. And to give another illustration of something like this happened, my client guest is currently today the top direct mail copywriter in the United States, but when I first met him, he was a magazine publisher, and he had a magazine called Free Enterprise, and it talked about how to make money in various different entrepreneurial businesses. His name is Pat Garrard, and I tried to identify with Pat what could we find about this magazine that would appeal to the media, and I came up with Pat Garrard, publisher of Free Enterprise Magazine, knows every screwball way there is to make money. Pat, I wish ask you to come up here for 1 second, because he can describe his experience on the road as a result of this letter, and then I'm going to describe how we never let him come home.
Well, there's the old saying, be careful what you wish for. And this guy was working for me as an editor, and I didn't realize he had other talents. And I was saying I wanted to get publicity. How do I get publicity? And to cut a long story short, he goes to work, and I end up going around the country, and it was like turning on a faucet, and I couldn't turn the damn thing off because all these shows and things became coming available to me. And the point about Berman here is his little secret is that he knows that good publicity has to be entertaining information. And if you've got something that sounds entertaining, right, the doors open up to you. So I was in this situation where, this is some time ago now, I wake up in the morning in some hotel in some city and think, where am I? You know?
If I may interrupt,
Yeah.
if I may interrupt, and the boss, people like it when the boss is away, and so every time I sent this letter out, they, in whatever city it was, they wanted him on. So Pat would call in and say, I'm in St. Louis, can I please come home now? And I said, no, tomorrow Cincinnati. And you know, the staff was standing behind me, keep him out. So anyway, but that is an example of finding that nugget, and of course you test your letters, so you try it with a little group. If it doesn't work, you change it until you find the one that does work, and that goes out to the whole country. And of course, creativity is also involved in finding the list of who to write to. And there are many tools in that regard. There's one, if anybody's taking notes, it's called cornerbarpr.com. And just sure, thanks. Thank you, Pat. And they have a section on that website called Contacts on Tap, and they will give you a free 2-week trial. And using Contacts on Tap, what you're able to do is pick any subject, let's say travel editors of every newspaper, magazine, television show in the country, and you click and it sets up an automatic template for you so that you can just email anyone in the media. It's very simple to use, and it's free. Now, there are also kind of abstract ways to find the people you're trying to reach. Let's say you want to get contact, you have an event coming in Pittsburgh, you want to contact everyone in the media in Pittsburgh. I didn't know I had a cough. You go to Google, let's say put in quotes, Pittsburgh 2008 media, and many, many groups put up names of media contacts because they want their members to contact the media for one reason or another. So you'll definitely find in every city these lists of media addresses. You take each address and put it back into Google and you'll find the other list. In very short time, you'll have the names of all the media people in every city in the United States. I like to personally call up, because I find like in the morning show, they may say, well, our producer is Grace Miller, she comes in at 4 in the morning, then I call them at 4 in the morning. People's names change all the time. But, you know, finding the names and also, if you're an amateur at this and very persistent, it's actually an advantage, excuse me. Because the professionals often, they may have 10 or 20 people they're representing, and they don't want to bother the media because they've got to come back to them and be in their good graces. As an amateur, you're not worried about that so much. As long as they welcome you to call again. I was trying to get a client who wanted to be in, have his product, software product in CIO magazine. And I called the editor, it was a woman, and she said, I'm very busy, and she said, but call me back. And she did that 28 times. But every time she was very pleasant, and since she kept inviting me, I kept going, and that 28th time she said, yes, come on up. And my client and I went up to Massachusetts, and we were sitting there, and she didn't realize that I was the person that she'd been talking with all that time, and she said to my client, I never invite anybody in to show their product, but your PR man was so non-annoying. And I said, that's the best thing you can say to a publicist, that he's non-annoying. Now, in terms of what the media will go for in a story, it's interesting that they really don't care what your credentials are, they're just looking for a good story. When I was Pat's editor, I remember at one point, the art director came in to me and he said, we're missing a page, and the magazine's got to go off right away, and the cover's already going off, and I've got to send the rest of the magazine. I don't know what to put in there. Now, given this idea that you just need a good story, and right in front of me on my desk was a letter from Guatemala saying how great Guatemalan garlic was. So an idea went off in my head, garlic opportunity of a lifetime. And out of this wonderful letter, I managed to write a story in about 20 minutes. But we were in a big rush, and we always gave some information at the end. Pat's wincing. We always gave some information at the end as to where people could contact. So I grabbed the white pages, and I gave the name of the Guatemalan consulate. Unfortunately, the woman there who ran the consulate was unaware of this activity. And 3 weeks later, she came to work, and there were 700 letters demanding information about garlic. She called me up and said, what is this garlic? I know, but anyway, we have found a good story. It doesn't matter where it comes from. And that applies to the network news as well as anywhere else, which brings me to my second guest, NBC producer Richard Watt, who, if he would come up for a second, just talk a little bit about how they review story ideas at NBC and how they come up with them. Richard.
Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, that's your misfortune.
We'll get over it.
Yes. Network news, everybody is so pressed. It's like that lady that Rich called 28 times and she was always too busy. You get people extremely busy. Now this can work for you or against you. You call somebody up and you say, I've got this great story. If you want to describe it over the phone, forget about it. Because the guy said, I got a fire, I got a robbery, I got a mall that collapsed. But you say, I know you're very busy. May I email it to you? So you made a contact, you got the guy's name, you're going to email it to him. A lot of things play. I know the Today Show wants to see your story in smaller media, unless it's hard news. Like, have you appeared in the local media in Des Moines, Iowa? I got a story. I was interviewed on the show, and then you can go up there and you can say, okay, I'll send you a DVD of my appearance on this. So the main thing is, like, if you want to get more publicity, start small. Get an article in the Poughkeepsie Journal, or you can send it to somebody else. This is an interesting story, and it's been run, but it hasn't been seen everywhere. Let's be the first to get it seen everywhere. So this is how the workload on the people at the networks and large media can work for you. Yes, they want stories. No, they don't have time to talk to you. It's like a peculiar thing. But if you make this contact, that'll work very well for you. I remember once I used to work the desk at night. That's the assignment desk. We would get all kinds of calls up until midnight, presumably thereafter. And as I like to say, as the evening went on, the calls got more and more chemically enhanced. Like one woman said, every person should have a chip implanted in him or her so we know where they are all the time. Well, some of us don't want people to know where we are all the time. If you turn it on. But I got a call one night, and it's a guy saying, I'm here in my house, and the police are outside, and they got it surrounded. And I won't say I'll use them, but I got weapons in here and all this. I said, can I put you on hold, please, sir? Where are you? And he told me, and I called the station in Texas. Obviously, this was not a network story, but I called them up and I said, do you have this situation going on? She says, yes. I said, well, I'm going to transfer this guy to you because he's the guy inside the house, and you may want to speak to him. So that's what she did. So, you know, anything at any time can come in over the transit, as they call it in publishing. And, you know, you get someone's ear. And if you write that email, by the way, you know, you're very familiar with the subject, but you got to make it stand out. Like, well, a story actually that you gave me where a woman was going to be a surrogate mother for triplets. It was the husband's sperm and the wife's eggs that were implanted in this young woman. So I said, I wrote a headline for it. In other words, Richard gave me the story and I spiced it up a bit. I said, family suit increased by 3 in New Jersey. How? You know, and then you go on. I don't think that NBC followed up on that, but there was some interest in me at first. So that's the way it works in the big media. Try it for the little media, then you can send it on to the big media, and you know, try to get a name. You know, there are switchboards, but as Richard said, you know, you go online, you can find out the name of the chief of the assignment desk, or the president of NBC News. I mean, he won't be interested.
I'm going to pick up a little bit on that subject, but thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. And what Richard was mentioning, you know, it's good not to focus in on say, well, I want to be on this particular program. Just like the old cliche that you see enough people, you'll sell. And this is certainly true with publicity. And because there are actually a lot of programs out there that give you more, you know, power to the punch that none of us have ever heard of before. There's, for example, I have a client that their specialty, Bark Busters, is they teach your dog not to bark. And the owner, who's a woman from Australia, was coming over here and they wanted to get on network news. I was not able to get him on network news. However, I was aware of a show from Florida, 2 women who syndicate news stories all over the country, meaning that individual stations in each market buy these stories and use them on their local news show. So they did this feature and they sent it out and it appeared on 92 stations, but no one's ever heard of them. Their name is Ivanhoe Broadcasting. There are radio shows that I recently got someone on a syndicated radio show. It's called Issues Today out of California. It's on 1,400 radio stations. And again, you would normally not have heard of it. So by going into this Contacts on Tap that I mentioned, you find a lot of outlets that you just were not aware were out there. So when someone comes to me and says, well, I want to be on Oprah, I'm very discouraging of thinking that way. And of course, it's nearly impossible. There's a site on the internet where most of the major publicity releases come out. And on that site, there are about 8 releases that appear a minute. And there's really no one whose job it is in the media to look at 8 publicity releases a minute. Most of them are not being looked at, which is the reason I'm not an advocate of publicity releases. I'm an advocate more of this promotional letter that I read earlier, and to try to get that differentiator and convince them to do the story. Releases, I think, are only good if you're planning an event. You want to say such and such is going to happen on such and such a date. Usually most people who have had any experience with them otherwise have not had a good one. Is there anyone here who's ever sent out a PR release? Were they helpful to you? Well, I take it back.
32 years I've been trying to bring a story and it hasn't happened.
Well, yeah, I think usually they're just not read anymore. There's just too many of them out there, and the public relations agencies, you know, they go in and they for a reason, they tell people, well, we're going to give you strategic positioning, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that, because by the time they ever got to the point where they'd ever get you in publicity, they've already made so much money it doesn't matter. But in fact, point of fact, doing PR releases, which they sell you, is generally not very effective. moving on, and at this point, I do have to refer 1 second to my notes, so I don't want to forget anything. How to piggyback on a local story into a national story, because if you're an expert or a consultant or something and you see that a big major national story breaks, or you have a client who's a consultant, you want to call that day and say, I have someone who can comment on that. And it's a good way to get your name in as an expert, and they keep lists in the newspapers and on television of the various experts. Another thing that's little known but very effective, and that is that the television networks take the best stories from their affiliate stations every day and they refeed them out, so that, let's say something interesting happens in Oklahoma City, they take it in by satellite, they feed it out, let's say at NBC, I think they have 204 affiliate stations, to all of those stations, because many of them have news shows and they don't have enough good stories to fill the day. So the result is that while you might try for 10 years to get on the nightly news and not be able to do it, you might be able with 2 phone calls to get your story on hundreds of stations. And the way that would work would be, let's say something interesting that you're involved in is happening in Cincinnati, and you convince the local NBC affiliate to cover that story. Then you call the syndication area at NBC, and I will give my email address, and anybody wants these numbers, I can send them to you. I'll give it right now before I forget. It's rberman226@gmail.com, and Rich Berman, and just write to me and I'll send you the numbers. But basically, you call the network and you say, a wonderful story has just been done in Cincinnati, and you describe that story to them. And if they like it, they'll say, well, we're going to pick that up. They will bring it in by satellite. They will feed it back out. I don't know, Richard, how many affiliates do they usually feed these to?
You were right about 204, 208, but I have to point out one thing, that while ABC and CBS syndication services, I believe, maybe I should come up.
Okay.
Yeah, because we're not hearing it on
Right,
the camera.
because he's,
I would try to
stand by everyone.
You can hear me very well out in the hall. While ABC and CBS syndication services are located within their headquarters building here in New York, NBC's syndication service, I used to be a senior producer on it when it was in New York, is located in North Carolina. It's called NBC News Channel, and it's actually located in Charlotte, North Carolina. So if you said, okay, you know, WMAQ in Chicago did this great story, and I think you'd want to syndicate it, you'd have to call down to Charlotte, North Carolina, the news channel, NBC News Channel down there, which is our syndication service. But Richard is absolutely right. A story that the network won't use can be still shown on hundreds of stations through syndication. And it's a very powerful way to get your message across.
I was hired at one time by Digital Equipment Corporation because they had put a sensor on they were sponsoring part of the Boston Marathon, and put a sensor on everyone's shoe so that you could immediately read on the internet, you know, at what point they won or lost or somewhere in between. And they were trying to get publicity for that, and I managed to convince the ABC station in Boston to cover that. Now, the reporter who covered it, I don't remember his last name, his first name was Jorge, and they said that everyone in Boston knew him. He'd been there for years. I think it was something like Jorge Piroga. So I called ABC in New York, and I didn't know anyone at all, but I called this area that I was telling you about, and I assumed that if he'd been in Boston for years, everyone would know him. So I called and I said, hi, Jorge just did a great story in Boston. They knew who I was. And they said, he did? And I said, yes, it's wonderful. They said, well, we're going to send it out. Result was it went out to 200 stations. They never knew after he hung up who I was. So it's okay to be a little brash, and it's kind of fun, really, to you know, have a result that something you're trying to get attention for receives that attention. In another instance, they was also Digital Equipment because they were the company that started the Alta Vista search engine back in the beginning. And the fellow who invented it was coming to New York, and they'd asked me to try to get him on a network news show. His name was Louis Monnier, and I couldn't get him on anything. But I happened to read a note somewhere that I saw the name of a producer at CBS named Tom Bradford, and I remembered. I said, "Thank God, I worked with a newsman named Tom Bradford at WOOD in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 1968. Couldn't be the same guy, but it's the same name in the same field, and he produced the CBS News show." So I called him up. He answered the phone, and I said, "Tom?" He said, "Yes." I said, "This is Rich Berman." And he said, "Rich Berman," and I acted very incensed, and I said, "Rich Berman from WOOD." He said, "Rich, how are you?" He put my guest on the air. So it's worth trying, and of course there's the old 6 degrees of separation. You probably likely know somebody who knows somebody in the media. And also picking up on what Richard was saying a little while ago, when I was at NBC, you did not you weren't looking for something that was in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and that's the advantage that all of you might have, is to start small, because if it was in the Oklahoma Gazette, it had some credibility because it was in print, but you knew that very few people had seen it. And so starting with the local business journal, starting with the local weekly paper, that's the way to go, and then build a spiraling effect. Another story out of my background that had to do again with Pat was many years ago, a friend of mine was working at Columbia University, and this is an example of the spiraling effect of publicity. She brought me a gift. It was a copy of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune from 1865, and I said, "How did you get this?" And she said, "Well, the university is doing away with its newspaper collection. They put it on microfilm." So I called the university, and there was a man in charge of a section called Gifts and Exchanges, and it turned out that he was the person who was releasing these papers. And I said, "Well, gee, I love this. Is there a possibility of getting a couple more?" And he said, "My job is to get rid of the whole collection. I can't give out one or two." So a friend and I rented a truck, and we went to Columbia, and we left with 100 years of the London Times from 1800 through 1900. And I lived in a 4th floor walk-up apartment in New York City. They went up to the ceiling. My sister called it a high-rise for roaches. I had this whole 100 years of London Times. Pat was starting his magazine at the time. I told him this story, and he came by to make sure that I hadn't made it up. There they were. So I wrote an article that appeared in his magazine. There was a Führer at Columbia University, and the Columbia University newspaper did a story. That was picked up by ABC. They did a television story. The New York Times picked up the story, and I would be on the bus in Manhattan, and I'd hear somebody say, "Did you hear about that man who got $2 million worth of old newspapers from Columbia University?" So it just kept growing, and the spiraling effect of it got bigger and bigger, and Pat went on the Mike Douglas show and told the story. Is that correct? So that's about the spiraling effect of publicity. I want to make sure I don't miss anything else. There are PR sites, PR groups on Yahoo and in other places where people exchange addresses. So if you're trying to get a particular program and you join these groups, and you can go out and say, I know there are at least 3 of them on Yahoo, so I'm trying to get on a particular program, who's the producer? And they share these names with each other. So that's a wonderful way to get the names of the people that you might want to contact. I'm on 3 on Yahoo. I know there are others, but I think there's one on LinkedIn, and I was planning to join that one. Something the media likes a great deal, particularly local papers, anniversaries, awards, and surveys. Surveys, you might notice a lot of them are very self-congratulatory. You might see a survey from, let's say, a hotel puts out a survey, a hotel that serves breakfast in the morning. Do you like to get breakfast in the morning at your hotel? And it turns out 95% of people say yes. They put that out as a news story, but people are interested and they get picked up. Anniversaries, always a good one, and giving out an interesting award, creating an interesting award, if you like. Another thing to please recall is if you're calling television and you're trying to get them to cover a particular story, please watch the program. It's a newspaper. Please read the newspaper in advance, because I think Richard would also concur. You get a lot of people who call, and they may be very young people, just we're starting out in public relations, and they'll give you an idea that's completely inappropriate, and I'll say, well, did you ever watch our show? And they say, no. So it's important to keep a good relationship with them, is to watch the show. You will get a lot of rejection, and the way I deal with that usually is I make a list. I write down what I'm going to say, and I write down a list of the people I'm going to call, and it becomes impersonal for me, because I just go down and I read what I'm going to say. If I'm rejected, I go on to the next one, and I don't take it personally. I also realize that they're very understaffed, and if you can imagine a local station that's putting on 2 hours of news a day and 6 or 7 guests a day and 40 or 50 a week, it's a crazed environment, and they're always breathy when you call, and but that's just part of it. So I never take it personally. And if you don't give up, you can go to stations in 50 states, and the 50th one, you'll find someone who loves your story. So it really is a matter of numbers. And again, using that contacts on tap, just about every contact in the United States is there. If you do it on trial, it's there for free. Are there any questions up to this point? Yes, sir?
Let's say you tell someone, you put out a press release, they want to know more about the story before they show up at the event. If you tell them what the event is in detail, they already know the story, they may not want to come. If you don't tell them, they're curious.
Well, I think the question, I'm going to repeat that, yes, is, tell me if I'm repeating it correctly, is you send a release, they want to know more. If you tell them too much, they're turned off and they don't show up.
That's right.
Well, I think there is a lot of sell the sizzle, and you don't ever want to put too much. I mean, it's with the one that I gave out, and it talked about the tying the host feet together. When she's gone out, and we just did these 3 shows this week, none of them asked to do that, but all of them said that's what got them interested in the story. So I think it is a dilemma, and I don't think there's any simple answer to that, because you're just taking your chances. If you go into detail and they're not interested, it may not have been a great story in the first place. You tend to fall, you may have fallen in love with it. Some more questions, I hope. None others, so go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
What if your story is a little bit controversial?
Can you amplify on that a little bit?
Okay. I'm involved in a documentary film about school lunch, and we were on page 1 of USA Today last summer. And the next day, Oprah called. I mean, the phone kept ringing, especially the Oprah show. I mean, we went on Fox News and some other things. And then suddenly we were sort of disinvited to the Oprah show, and I think it's because when the producers saw the film, they saw that there were parts of the film that were a little bit negative towards the food industry.
I don't think that's a problem for Oprah. She said when mad cow disease came out, that she wasn't going to touch beef anymore. I think that when it showed up in Fox, they said, oh, they got its publicity already. I think that's more what was operative. I could be wrong, but.
She asked what if a story is viewed as too controversial. It reminded me, I mentioned earlier publicity I've done for this group that teaches your dog not to bark, and we got coverage on WNBC in New York, and I was with the client, and I thought, this is wonderful. Well, for some reason, the reporter felt this was just not controversial enough. She had to go out and find somebody who didn't think you should teach your dog not to bark. So I'm sitting there with the client, and suddenly up comes this expert who said, never teach your dog not to bark. That's terrible. The dog will be able to bark. And I don't think there's any answer to what you're saying, as well as with the gentleman over here, because you can't, you're telling the truth, you're telling your story, and you can't affects somebody's reaction to that story. And I guess it's just to get it out to as many places as possible, keep your fingers crossed. But there's no way, you don't want to lie, you don't want to be duplicitous, so you're, telling the truth. And you obviously they're so busy that if you reframe it another way in about 2 months and send it out again, it's likely it'll be seen by a whole different group of editors and producers. That would be my only answer.
For instance, 2 weeks ago, we had the biggest beef recall in U.S. history. Most of that meat went out to schools across the country. And I'm still watching and wondering why nobody's upset.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people here will concur that, we spend too much time on Britney Spears or O.J. Simpson and not enough on, tainted beef and substantial stories. And I would say, when you're upset, and Joan and I were talking about this earlier tonight, sit down and write to the media. I've gotten answers from I've gotten answers from Anderson Cooper. I've gotten answers from Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times. I don't know any of these people. I've gotten pretty adept at finding the addresses. And when you are, when you're angry, when you have something that you think deserves coverage and it doesn't get it, sit down and write to them. When I worked on the nightly news at NBC, and again, I think Richard would concur, we might have a controversial story on it. It might have been seen by 20 million people, but we might only get 2 or 3 phone calls at the end of the show. And so those 2 or 3 calls, in my mind, represented a much larger group of people who either didn't think anyone would listen, couldn't figure out how to get the number, et cetera, et cetera. So when your letter does come in, they pay a lot of attention because they think it represents a lot more people who are thinking that way, and sometimes it will result in coverage. So I would, it's pretty easy to figure out the systems, like, CNN would be, if I worked at CNN, richard.berman@turner.com. Sometimes I will see a reporter, I've seen a report from Baghdad, I didn't agree with it, so the reporter's name is on the super, and I just put, bob.morris@turner.com, and 5 minutes later I have an answer back from Baghdad, Iraq. They do answer you, it's amazing. I hope that was inspiring. Yes, I'm
Now,
sorry.
I make a suggestion, is what you had just said before, that if you reframe it, you already did documentary, you already submitted it once, you already have a national epidemic of this beef. This would be a perfect time for you to go out and redistribute all of this information again. It would be fresh for people now.
Also, a video of the downed cattle is what really sold the story.
Because they can't hear you, I'm saying, someone in the audience is suggesting.
I was just saying that video of the downed cattle is what really sold the story. And, even though, like, your video may not have been interesting when you first put it out, it become interesting again.
And the woman was suggesting that while you may miss the first time, and then 2 months later, the story breaks big in the news, that's the time to go back in when they're looking for an expert. Anybody else? Nobody came here with something they wanted to hear? Yes.
This might be a little off the main focus of your topic, but as far as publicity for a person where they're looking for a job and they have a situation where their resume is just not, in the conventional way of putting a resume, going to do the best job of creating as a marketable person. Can you suggest anything of how a person might capture people's attention?
Well, the question is in terms of publicity for a resume and how to get attention. And I guess if it was an individual case and I saw it, I might be able to come up with something a little catchy. In general, I do think it's wonderful to do some volunteer work in that area and get to know people and then they see your services and you begin to get job offers. But I'd really have to see the resume you're sending. I tend to think most of the good jobs, the way to get them, the way I get clients is I send out advertising, and that's the same way I'd get a job, because when the job's listed somewhere, maybe there's 100 or 1,000 people applying. You send out a great promotional letter, you may hit them when they're just about to advertise and they never look for somebody else. There's your letter. So I don't really think the resume often is the best way to get a job. I think writing a really convincing letter is a good way to get a job. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How helpful or harmful is it to try and promote something on these social networking sites like MySpace and Facebook and all the other stuff that might come ancillary to it, where somebody might try and criticize you or use their blogging space to try and criticize you or something?
Frankly, a lot of this is anecdotal to me because I don't have a lot of experience with it. But certainly, we see a YouTube video that if it catches on and gets buzzed, millions of people see it. But it's not something I'm that conversant in yet. I hope to get more so. I mean, most of these blogs are people are telling you what they had for lunch, and it doesn't interest me, But if you can find something that gets passed around, as you know, it's like lightning. So I guess I can't be more helpful with that question. Anybody else? Well, my job's been to speak, and yours has been to listen. I hope we both finished at the same time. Thank you very much.